So, let us learn at least a little bit from Rambam. Hilchot Kriyat Shema, Perek Sheni, Halacha Aleph. I will call this up on the screen. Rambam says, Hakoreh et Shema, he who reads Shema, which we discussed in the previous chapter, V'lo kiwen libo b'fasuk rishon, but did not focus on what he was saying whilst reading the first pasuk, which is Shema Yisrael, as Rambam says here, Shehu Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Lo yasar dechovato. Even if you read all of Kriyat Shema with kavanah halev means you were focused and aware of what you were saying, and you thought about what you were saying. That is kavanah halev. That is to say, literally, attention, focus of the heart on what you were saying. But in that first pasuk, you did not have this kavanah. You were daydreaming. You were just reciting the words by rote without really thinking about it. Lo yasa yedei chovato. A person did not fulfill his chovah to read Kriyat Shema. Hashar, but the rest of Kriyat Shema, everything beyond that first pasuk, im lo kiwen yasa. But if you did have this kavanah, this basic minimal kavanah during that first pasuk, and then you lost that kavanah, you began to daydream, your mind began to wander, and you were thinking about anything other than the words you were reciting from Kriyat Shema. If this was the case for all of Kriyat Shema and all the brachot, except for the first pasuk where you were focused, yasar dechovato, and you don't have to repeat Kriyat Shema. But if for that first pasuk you did not have such kavanah, you did not perform the mitzvah. Lo yasar dechovato. Afilu yakore b'Torah kedarko, and Rambam therefore goes on to illustrate the point. Afilu hayakore b'Torah kedarko. A person was studying Torah. It wasn't his intention right now necessarily to perform the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. He was reading from Sefer Devarim. So he happened to be reading Parashat Shema in Sefer Devarim. Or, alternately, another example, O magia et ha-parashiyot ha'elu be'onav Kriyat. In other words, for example, where do you find the first two parashiyot of Shema, Parashat Shema and Parashat U'hayom Shema? That is to say, in Perek Shishi, the 6th Perek of Devarim, and the 11th Perek, Perek Yod Aleph of Devarim. If a person was being magia a mezuzah, in other words, you were checking a mezuzah to make sure that it was written correctly, that all words were present, nothing was left out, no letter was left out, that it's legible, each letter is clear as to what letter it is supposed to be, so that a kaf and a bet can be distinguished from one another, or a waw and a nun sofith can be distinguished from one another, etc., etc. The person was magiat ha-parashiyot ha'elu bonat kriya, and he was doing so by reciting it, reading it off the klaf, reading it off the mezuzah to himself, to see that everything is there. So a person can perform the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema in such a fashion, yasa. If a person, but this is on condition, v'hu shekiweni bo b'pasuk rishon. Assuming that you had the kavanah to internalize the message of that first pasuk of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, if you had that kavanah during the reciting of that first pasuk, you were yedei chova. A person fulfilled the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. You may ask, of course, wait a second, if a person is being magia mezuzot, a person is checking mezuzot. It could also be a pair of tefillin, could be the same thing. And this is his job. He gets paid for checking mezuzot. Min hastam, one assumes that he did not recite any of the barachot together with the reading of the parasha, or one or two or more parashiyot of Kriyat Shema. We have to assume that. That's a reasonable assumption. So what happens? What does one do about these barachot? The answer is explicitly stated in the Talmud Yerushalmi on this Mishnah that Zot Omeret Berachot Einan Me'akvoth, that the Berachot do not hold one back literally from performing the mitzvah. So if a person just read Parashat Shema without Berachot, one is Mekayim the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. Not fully, not correctly, not as it should be, but one is Yotzei Dehova. The word Yotzei always is to be understood as b'di'avad. In other words, this is not the ideal and proper way to perform the mitzvah, but if one did so, one performed the mitzvah. So that's what Rambam has informed us of in this halakha.
Rabbi,
Yes.
what precisely does the kavanah here refer to? The kavanah of fulfilling the mitzvah, or the kavanah of understanding what one is saying, or just the kavanah that I'm doing something and I'm not just reading some random letters, or any other such thing?
In other words, if I understand you, your question is as follows. Is the kavanah that is referred to here, is it the kavanah of reciting the words and noting and focusing on what you are saying, what the words of the Torah, the holy words of the Holy Torah, what they are imparting to you? You're in that moment, and you are fully aware of what you are saying and doing, and you're internalizing the words of the Torah. That's one way of understanding kavanat halev. And another way of understanding it is that this is what I think you are referring to or hinting at. Does one have to have in mind the kavanah that I am now performing the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema min Torah? Correct? That's what you meant?
Yes.
Okay. A very good question. First of all, I would tell you that a simple reading of what we just read in the Rambam now indicates that he's referring to listening, to hearing what one is saying. In other words, to take note of what one is reciting, or as Chazal expressed it in the Talmud, or similar to this idea. It's not the same idea, but it's related. In other words, we also know there's a halakha, as we're about to see later, that one has to recite Kriyat Shema aloud. One cannot think it in one's head, nor should one whisper it. One should recite it aloud, and also one should enunciate it very clearly. What the Lashon of the Rambam seems to clearly indicate is that one has to be focused on the words that one is saying, and internalize the message of those pasukim of Kriyat Shema. Lechatchila, all of Kriyat Shema, no question. But the Avad, at least the first pasuk. There are amongst the Tanaim various views as to whether one pasuk is the minimum. This pasuk of Shema Yisrael is the minimum requirement, the minimum shiur of kavanat halev for Kriyat Shema, or whether one requires to have kavanah for the first three pasukim, or for the first parasha altogether, all the parasha of Shema Yisrael. The halakha Rambam is telling us here, which is the view of Rabbi Meir, and the Talmud Bavli clearly is posek this way, that the kavanat halev is required at a minimum for the first pasuk. There is no indication here in the Rambam that one has to have any kavanah beyond reading the words of the pasuk and understanding the words and internalizing their message. There is no indication here anywhere in the Rambam that one has to think, as one finds in some sidurim, hineni muchanu muzuman nekiyam mitzvah taseh shel Kriyat Shema, or any such statement. It also, however, follows, by the way, it's more than reasonable to assume that a person who reads Kriyat Shema knows why he's doing it. He's not doing it simply because he had nothing else to do and he was bored, has v'shalom, and not even only simply because he wanted to study Torah. That's exactly what the Rambam said at the end of this first halakha. Afilu ha'koreva Torah kedarko, even though what you were involved in doing right now was limud Torah, Talmud Torah, and you happen to find yourself at Parashat Shema. Im, Rambam said, you can be Yoseh Chovah in that fashion as well. You have to. Why would you focus particularly on those psukim at this point? You're just reading you're studying Sefer Devarim. You're reading from Sefer Devarim. So why do you need any particular kavanah? So we see that you need to have the kavanah of thinking and focusing on these pasukim specifically, particularly, more than perhaps other pasukim. So that indicates that a person knows that he is performing the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, and he knows why he's doing this thing. But it doesn't state that anywhere here in the words that we saw in the Rambam. Nor is such a statement, such an understanding to be found in the Sugyot, in the Talmud, in the Bavli, or the Yerushalmi on this matter. And there's something else that needs to be added in this context. And we didn't mention this last time, but therefore this is a good time to mention it right now. Very relevant to mention this right now. If you recall, at the beginning of Hilchot Kriyat Shema, Rambam states here, at the very outset, Rambam says, Mitzvot aseh ahat. In this section of halachot, this section called Hilchot Kriyat Shema, there is one mitzvah aseh min haTorah, v'hi likrot Kriyat Shema pa'amayim b'yom. So Rambam is of the opinion, as Rambam explains at length in Sefer Mitzvot, the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema is min haTorah. Rambam goes on to say, at the beginning of Perek Aleph of Hilchot Kriyat Shema that we looked at last time, Rambam says here in Halacha Aleph, Pa'amayim b'chol yom kore'im Kriyat Shema ba'erev u'b'boker shene'emar u'v'shoch b'cha v'komecha. Rambam doesn't say anything about it being midivrei soferim, as Rambam usually does if something is not min haTorah. And Rambam previously said explicitly that it's a mitzvah aseh, so we understand clearly that Rambam's position is this is a mitzvah aseh min haTorah. Rambam is once again following in the footsteps of the Rif and many of the Geonim in Bavel, but not all of the Geonim in Bavel, it has to be pointed out. And that's my point right now. In other words, it is clearly a mahloket in the Talmud. There is not the slightest doubt about this, because Shemuel, the famous Amorah, Shemuel, one of the greatest of the first generation of the Amoraim, states explicitly that if a person is unsure whether they recited Kriyat Shema or not, they're not required to repeat it. Why? The Talmud explains, because Shmuel holds that Kriyat Shema is not min haTorah, it's min divrei soferim, it's min derabanan. And there are a number of Rishonim who hold that this is the halacha. More significant, it is clear from when one looks into the relevant sugyot in the Talmud Bavli that this was the firm and uncontested maskana of the Talmud Bavli. This was the conclusion of the Talmud Bavli. The Kriyat Shema is midivrei soferim in the earlier generations of the Geonim, and only later was this conclusion revised, and therefore also the nuschaot of the Talmud, various readings in the various discussions in the Talmud which pertain to this discussion, were amended so that one would understand that Kriyat Shema is min haTorah. And this is not, for example, the opinion of the Hilchot. In the Hilchot of Ahai Gaon, it is clear that he held his girasa, and he's going with the earlier girasa. We have that earlier girasa still. It somehow survived in certain sources, in certain manuscripts, as discussed by some of the Rishonim, and it's mefurash in the Hilchot of Ahai Gaon that Kriyat Shema is not min haTorah. The Netziv, Gaon Netziv, in his Perush on the Hilchot, discussing this matter at great length, writes that he says we are unable to decide whether Kriyat Shema is minat Torah or midivrei soferim, because despite what I just said about the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud Yerushalmi states clearly and unequivocally that Kriyat Shema is minat Torah. So we can't answer that question categorically. Rambam does give a categorical answer or a conclusion, but it's not the only opinion. That's the fact. So if you, building on what we just said, if you take this fact that it's possible that Kriyat Shema is not actually technically minat Torah, it's clearly hinted at in the Torah, the idea of constantly reciting and repeating and memorizing divrei Torah, v'shinamtam levonecha, v'dibarta bam, etc. It's clearly what the Torah is getting at. That is the thrust of the Torah. But the question is, did the Torah specifically mandate reading a particular part of the Torah at a particular time of day, or is uv'shoch v'chav komecha a general teaching, just as it goes on to say, there's no mitzvah specifically to read this or to read that when you are going somewhere, walking somewhere, going about your business. And you could understand that what the pasuk is saying is, as Rav Yosef says in the Talmud Bavli, Ahu b'divrei Torah kativ. In other words, when the Torah says, it is referring to the fact that at all times you should be focused on the Torah. You can understand the pasuk that way, as Rav Yosef points out, explaining the position of Shmuel, and you can understand it differently, that it is mandating a particular form of Talmud Torah, because that's what Kriyat Shema is. It's a standardized and mandated type of Talmud Torah for all Jews every day, twice a day. You can understand the pasuk that way as well. So without belaboring this point any further, if Kriyat Shema is not or may not be from the Torah, then clearly you are not required to have the kavanah that I'm performing the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema min Torah at this moment, because perhaps it's not so at all. Maybe there is no such mitzvah aseh at all. If there is such a mitzvah aseh, as is the conclusion of many of the latter-day Geonim and most of the Rishonim, including Rambam, as we see, then you could ask the question that you're asking. And then the answer would be, as I said, that despite all of that, there is no indication in the Rambam that you have to have any kavanah beyond taking note of the various ideas and messages and teachings encapsulated in the words of the Torah that you are reciting.
In other words, mitzvot tzarichot kavanah is a reference to the fact that you know what you're doing, not the fact that you said, hinani muchan uzuman, I know I'm fulfilling this mitzvah aseh, and so on and so forth. It's just, I'm conscious that I'm doing this thing, and I'm aware of the implications of it.
Well, based on everything I just said, one must understand that it is not possible really to compare this mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, for all the reasons that we just explained, and for a further reason, that the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, however you define the mitzvah, is the mitzvah of reciting words from the Torah. And what possible purpose could there be in reciting a section of the Torah, from the Torah, if you're doing it in a almost catatonic state? In other words, you're not aware almost of what you're saying. It's just the words are just tumbling out of your mouth by rote, and your mind is completely elsewhere. you cannot compare that kind of mitzvah of Kriyat Shema to, shall we say, the mitzvah of Nishmu'a Kol Shofar. Right, one of the clearest sugyot in the Mishnah with regards to mitzvot tzrichot kavanah is shofar. When you hear the shofar, the pshat of the Mishnah is that im kimenach libo yatsa, with regards to shofar, means that you have to think to yourself, I'm not just happening to hear the sound of a shofar being blown by someone who decided for no apparent reason to blow a shofar today. And that could happen any day of the year. You might hear someone blow the shofar. You don't have to think anything or do anything with that fact. But on this day of Rosh Hashanah, when there is a mitzvah to blow and to hear the shofar being blown, you have to have an awareness that there is a mitzvah to hear this sound that the shofar produces on Rosh Hashanah, on this particular day. There, it's clear that the meaning is that when you hear this thing, you have to be aware that there is a mitzvah to hear this thing, and not just to hear it passively, as you would hear background noise or the traffic or whatever it might be. And the same is true of many other mitzvot, such as lulav or what have you. There's an interesting question with regards to achilat masa and Rambam's position on the subject, which is a deep and a separate discussion. But mostly mitzvot which are a ma'aseh, which involve a certain physical action, or in the case of hearing shofar, which is not maybe a physical action, but it's a kind of physical action. You have to pay attention to that which you are hearing with your ear, with your physical ear. So you have to be aware that there's a mitzvah to hear this sound, and it's not just some background noise. When it comes to reading words from the Torah, it's not a physical act of doing this or doing that. The entire exercise is one which obviously requires kavanah. Otherwise, what possible purpose is there in such a thing? So these to try and extrapolate from this mitzvah of Kriyat Shema to all other mitzvot, I think is misguided. All right?
Yes, thank you.
Very well. I think we will have to stop here for today. היו ברוכים נתבשר בשורות טובות, ישועות, נקמות וממילא נחמות. May we zocher to see the downfall of all our enemies, foreign and domestic, מבית ומחוץ, בקרוב בימינו, אמן ואמן. שלום וניצחון.